Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, another one of President Trump's nominees confirmed. In a narrow win in the Senate, Kash Patel is confirmed as the new director of the FBI. Jason Blair has the latest. Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky announces today that he will not run for re-election in 2026. McConnell is the longest-serving Senate leader in U.S. history. Hamas hands over the bodies of 4 hostages, and Israelis line the streets to honor their return. Meanwhile, empty buses explode in Israel in what appears to be a terrorist attack. Jason Perry reports. The White House defends President Trump's handling of the Russia-Ukraine war. Arian Pazdar has the criticism coming from Europe and how the White House responds. A D.C. federal judge today allowing the Trump administration to temporarily continue downsizing the government workforce. He said the unions likely filed a case in the wrong court.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. The FBI has a new director. Kash Patel was confirmed by the Senate this afternoon. NTD correspondent Jason Blair has the update.
The yeas are 51. The nays are 49. The confirmation is confirmed.
Kash Patel squeezes through the Senate to become the new director of the FBI with a vote 51 to 49. There were 51 Republican votes, and all Democrats and independents voted no, with 2 Republicans, Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, joining the noes. Ahead of the vote, Murkowski said that her opposition stems from Patel's past political activity. She said, quote, "I have been disappointed that when he had the opportunity to push back on the administration's decision to force the FBI to provide a list of agents involved in the January 6 investigations, he failed to do so." Patel is leading the FBI at a time of unrest. President Donald Trump and other Republicans have alleged on several occasions that the FBI is being used for political purposes.
And at the same time, the FBI has lost the trust of many Americans who fear the agency has become politicized.
He has said on day one he plans to, quote, shut down the FBI headquarters, and he's falsely claimed that the FBI, quote, was planning the January 6th event for a year beforehand. There is no truth to that statement, Mr. President.
FBI directors serve 10-year terms. However, the commander-in-chief does have the power to remove them. And nominee Linda McMahon moves forward in her nomination to lead the Department of Education. The Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee voted to advance McMahon. The committee voted 12 to 11 along party lines. McMahon served as Trump's Small Business Administration head during his first term. There's been no word yet when a full Senate vote will happen. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
Republican Senator Mitch McConnell announced today that he won't seek re-election next year. McConnell, the longest-serving Senate party leader in U.S. history, chose his 83rd birthday to share his decision not to run for another term in Kentucky and to retire when his current term ends. He made the announcement when he was addressing colleagues in a speech on the Senate floor.
7 times, my fellow Kentuckians have sent me to the Senate. Every day in between, I've been humbled by the trust they placed in me to do their business right here. Representing our Commonwealth has been the honor of a lifetime. I will not seek this honor an 8th time. My current term in the Senate will be my last.
McConnell, first elected in 1984, intends to serve the remainder of his term ending in January 2027. The Kentuckian has dealt with a series of medical episodes in recent years, including injuries sustained from falls and times when his face briefly froze while he was speaking. His dramatic announcement comes almost a year after his decision to quit his leadership post after the 2024 election. South Dakota Senator John Thune, a top McConnell deputy, replaced him as majority leader. The White House today defending President Trump's handling of the Russia-Ukraine war. This comes amid concerns Europe and Ukraine would not be involved in the peace talks, and accusations against Trump coming out of Kyiv. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pazdar has what the White House says about the Ukraine situation.
Some of the rhetoric coming out of Kyiv, frankly, and insults to President Trump were unacceptable.
The White House on Thursday defending how President Trump is handling the peace process in the Russia-Ukraine war. Relations between the US and Ukraine took a hit after the US and Russia started to improve relations and begin peace talks. For example, Trump said this about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier this week.
We're the leader in Ukraine. I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating. Wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, like, you know, it's been a long time since we've had an election?
Zelensky then fired back, accusing Trump of, quote, living in a Russian disinformation space. Zelensky also said his approval rating wasn't at 4%. The White House on Thursday was asked whether Trump is being manipulated by Russia.
First, if there's anybody in this world that can go toe-to-toe with Putin, that could go toe-to-toe with Xi, that could go toe-to-toe with Kim Jong-un, it's Donald J. Trump. He is the deal maker in chief.
European allies and Ukraine have repeatedly voiced concerns that Trump is leaving them out of the peace talks with Russia. The White House says it's important to push back against that notion, which it says is not true.
I already mentioned the immediate phone call President Trump made to President Zelensky. He has talked to President Macron of France repeatedly last week. President Macron convened European leaders and then is coming here on Monday. Prime Minister Starmer is coming.
And J.D. Vance on Thursday also defending the fact that Trump has restarted dialogue with Russia.
When he walks into negotiation, he says everything is on the table. And of course, that makes the heads explode in the American media because they say, why are you talking to Russia? Well, how are you going to end the war unless you're talking to Russia? You've got to talk to everybody involved in the fighting.
And Special Envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, is in Kyiv on Thursday. He met with Zelensky for talks about ending the fighting. There was no immediate comment from either side on the outcome of the talks. Zelensky's office says their planned joint news conference was cancelled at the request of the U.S. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
Autocratic nations of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are deepening ties. China at the cornerstone. Experts today on Capitol Hill joined lawmakers to discuss what's at stake for the world order and how the U.S. should respond. NTD's Melina Weisskopf reports.
China strengthening relations with Russia, Iran, and North Korea at a rapid pace, an alignment that experts are calling the axis of upheaval. Panelists shed light on how crucial China's support is to lengthening Russia's war on Ukraine. And in exchange for China's support, Russia is helping China to develop its defense capabilities.
Russia provided China with sophisticated technology that will make submarines, Chinese submarines, quieter and more difficult to track. Such an agreement was nearly impossible to imagine just 2 to 3 years ago, given the highly sensitive nature of that technology.
So what is the ultimate goal of the autocratic nations deepening ties? Experts say the end game is to undermine U.S. strength and influence on the world stage, putting individual rights and freedoms on the line.
Cross-border efforts to normalize censorship and surveillance, keep people divided and afraid, and cloak their moves to consolidate power in a web of opacity.
The panelists, however, disagreed on how best to approach the aligning nations. One said that the ties aren't that deep to begin with, therefore a simple end to the Russia-Ukraine war would suffice, while another said those ties are already too deep for one simple solution.
If we strike a very bad deal over Ukraine, you could see a calming down. It could take some of the urgency out of the relationship. You know, ending the war is not enough.
So my view is that China doesn't in the end want to just be the head of this coalition with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It wants a much greater role in the world. It wants to be America's equal on the world stage.
And all this comes as President Trump's taking a 180 turn from the previous administration on how to approach the Russia-Ukraine war.
I'd like to hear from each of the panelists. How do you think that Beijing is viewing what looks like a new partnership between the U.S. and Russia that even goes beyond the war in Ukraine?
The assumptions about what engagement with today's Russia will bring us is really predicated on our likely ability, A, to prize Russia away from this deeper relationship with today's PRC.
All panelists agree that the U.S. is not taking the threat seriously enough and should re-strategize how to move forward to protect the world order and liberty. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
A sad day in Israel today as members of the Hamas terrorist group handed over the bodies of 4 hostages. Meanwhile, empty buses exploded south of Tel Aviv in what appears to be a terrorist attack. NTD's Jason Perry brings us the latest.
Armed Hamas terrorists and other civilians gathered in the southern Gaza Strip as they prepared to hand over the bodies of 4 hostages to the Red Cross. The bodies are said to be those of Shiri Bibas, her 2 sons, and Oded Lifshitz. One woman shared her thoughts as they waited for the Red Cross to arrive.
We, all the entire people, are afraid of the war returning because we have seen all the fear and all the humiliation. We have seen and experienced all the suffering. We do not want war at all.
And soon after, Hamas terrorists were seen handing over caskets to members of the Red Cross, who then loaded them into their vehicles and drove away. And on the other side of the border, Israeli officers saluted as the convoy carrying the bodies traveled to the Forensics Institute in Tel Aviv to confirm their identities. People were seen lining the streets with Israeli flags as the convoy drove past.
This is so sad and painful how this really ends. I am relieved that they are having a dignified ceremony today and they will be buried on our land, on Israel.
Others gathered in Tel Aviv in an area now called Hostages Square.
It's not just 4 people, it's more than that. It's the sense of helplessness, the fact that this country could not bring back these people alive. And it's a sense of national mourning, I guess.
And more people waited outside of the Forensic Center, where the bodies will be identified. And later on Thursday, the head of Israel's National Center of Forensic Medicine expressed his condolences to the Lifshitz family before confirming the deceased body of Oded Lifshitz. As of 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the identities of the other 3 bodies were not confirmed publicly. And in another development in a city south of Tel Aviv, 2 buses exploded, according to a commander of the Tel Aviv police. He said the explosions weren't limited to that particular area.
As of now, we have 5 scenes, 3 explosive devices that have detonated, and 2 that bomb disposal units are currently working on.
Authorities also said there were no injuries from the incident as the bombs exploded when the buses were empty. Jason Perry, NTD News.
A federal judge today rejected a request from a group of labor unions to stop the Trump administration from downsizing the federal workforce. U.S. District Judge Christopher Cooper in Washington allowed the workforce reductions to temporarily continue as the case plays out. The National Treasury Employees Union and 4 other unions sued last week to block the administration from firing hundreds of thousands of federal workers and granting buyouts to employees who quit voluntarily. Judge Cooper said he likely lacks the power to hear the case. He recommended that the unions file complaints with a federal labor board that hears disputes between unions and federal agencies. And a federal judge today considered whether to issue an indefinite restraining order on the Trump administration's freeze on federal funding. This comes 2 weeks after the judge extended a temporary block on the freeze. NTD's Arlene Richards has the details.
A D.C. federal judge considered Thursday additional arguments on whether to make a temporary block on the Trump administration's federal funding freeze indefinite. Last month, a group of nonprofits sued the administration's Office of Management and Budget, claiming an executive order requiring agencies to temporarily pause federal funding would cause irreparable harm to nonprofits and small businesses. Judge Lauren Alicon had issued 2 temporary restraining orders before the hearing. The second order, which extended the temporary block, was in response to plaintiffs' complaints that some nonprofits still could not access funding. Now, plaintiffs argue that the funding has resumed, but they fear that the administration will pause funds again, absent an order from the court. The Justice Department's attorney said the case is moot now that the funds have been released. He argued that the judge should not consider possibilities, but should view the case based on what's presented now. Judge Alicon asked specific questions about a memo issued after the administration's order, which provided guidance. She questioned whether the pause applied to all agencies across the board or to a limited number. The answer to that question may determine whether the judge issues an indefinite restraining order across all agencies or only the agencies that impact the plaintiffs. The judge will make a decision at a later date. Meanwhile, a Rhode Island federal judge is set to hear arguments Friday after issuing an indefinite restraining order on the freeze last month. Judge John Mcconnell will consider whether to order a permanent block on the funding freeze. He issued an indefinite block after hearing a case filed by several Democratic states arguing that the funding freeze interfered with states receiving billions of dollars in aid. The Justice Department is expected to argue that the matter is moot now that the funding has resumed. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
President Trump is honoring Black History Month at the White House today. Trump addressed a crowd alongside golf legend Tiger Woods.
It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here with you, Mr. President, and to be honored here with all of you. Thank you so much.
Today we pay tribute to the generations of Black legends, champions, warriors, and patriots who helped drive our country forward to greatness. And you really are great people.
During his speech, Trump addressed some of the people who are standing in the crowd. One of them was Scott Turner, who's the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Turner is also a former cornerback who played in the NFL for 9 seasons. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina was in the crowd as well. Trump congratulated Scott for becoming the longest-serving Black senator in U.S. history. And the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, also attended today's event, though when Trump mentioned Bourla, the cheers in the crowd became less and people started booing instead. Trump concluded his speech by saying that working together among Americans will help make America, quote, greater than ever before. Coming up, millions remain under winter weather alerts as record-breaking cold grips the nation. The deadly storm wreaked havoc across multiple states, claiming several lives, causing hundreds of crashes and bringing travel to a standstill. Christina Corona has the weather update. And a bomb threat leads to evacuations before a Shenyang performance in Washington, D.C. An MC for the classical Chinese dance company says this isn't the first time. Chris Beers brings us the details after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. New York City Mayor Eric Adams can keep his job, but there's a catch. New York State Governor Kathy Hochul was considering removing Mayor Adams after the DOJ moved to dismiss the federal corruption charges against him. She's letting him stay, but says she'll take steps to curb his power. Hochul says the Trump administration is already trying to use the legal jeopardy facing our mayor as leverage to squeeze and punish our city. After the Justice Department's motion, Adams vowed to allow immigration enforcement to operate at New York's Rikers Island prison. The move furthers President Trump's deportation plans and overrides so-called sanctuary city laws in the state. Hochul has the power to dismiss mayors. She chose not to use that power on Adams, but plans to implement restraints on his office.
First, I'm proposing legislation to create a special Inspector General for New York City affairs within the Office of the State Inspector General. Second, I'm proposing giving the City Comptroller, the Public Advocate, and the New York City Council Speaker an independent authority to clarify the independent language to commence litigation against the federal government when necessary and using outside counsel. Third, I'm expanding funding for the Office of the Deputy State Comptroller General, Comptroller for City Oversight, because this stepped-up oversight, again, gives us an independent line of sight into potential decisions related to the federal government.
Hochul said these guardrails would help reestablish trust amongst New Yorkers. Mayor Adams remains defiant in spite of growing calls for him to step down. He says, "I will never surrender, never step down. I'm going to step up and fight." Millions remain under winter weather alerts as a deadly storm moves out of the mid-Atlantic. The powerful system brought heavy snow, extreme cold, and travel chaos across multiple states. NTD's Christina Corona tells us more.
Snow is finally easing across Virginia and North Carolina after a powerful winter storm claimed at least 4 lives. 2 in Nebraska, including a state trooper, 1 in North Carolina, and 1 in Tennessee. Hazardous conditions caused over 800 crashes in Virginia on Wednesday, injuring at least 45 people. Air travel was also disrupted, with over 150 flights canceled at Charlotte Douglas International Airport and delays in Raleigh and Dallas. The National Weather Service reported preliminary snowfall totals, including 55 inches in Teton Village, Wyoming, 16 inches in Sundell, Michigan, 13 inches in Virginia Beach, and 11 inches in Rochester, New York, and Moyock, North Carolina. Freezing temperatures stretched from Montana to Florida, impacting 230 million Americans. Nebraska City saw record-breaking lows, with Omaha at -12 degrees, Lincoln at -17 degrees, and Norfolk hitting -18 degrees. Edgemont, South Dakota hit -38 degrees, while Columbia, Missouri broke a 1929 record with -6 degrees. Forecasters warn of more record lows across the South, including Texas and Oklahoma, through Friday. Although the storm is moving offshore, freezing rain and black ice remain serious hazards. Authorities are urging residents to stay off the roads in affected areas. Christina Corona, NTD News.
A bomb threat directed at Shen Performing Arts led to an evacuation at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. The classical Chinese dance company and its artists say that, unfortunately, they're used to it. NTD's Chris Beers is following this developing story.
A morning of preparations for Shen Performing Arts production staff flipped on its head by yet another bomb threat, this one at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Hours before their performance, police received notice of the threat at 10:44 a.m., according to a Kennedy Center spokesperson. The MC for tonight's performance, Li Shai Lemish, says there were 15 police cars at the scene, and the Shen crew waited outside in the cold for 3 hours. Officers shut down roads in the area.
We're kind of used to it. I mean, imagine you're a performer in a dance company based in New York, and you're just used to getting bomb threats, and you're used to getting death threats. And the kind of email threats that we're getting back at headquarters saying they're going to throw us off of buildings, we're going to be killed in mysterious car accidents, and our houses are going to be burnt down, their family members are going to be murdered. And this is almost a daily occurrence.
Shen is a classical Chinese dance troupe based in upstate New York, whose mission is to restore and showcase traditional Chinese culture. If you visited a major city recently, you've probably seen their billboards. Shen Performing Arts says the threats, often in Chinese, are usually linked to the Chinese Communist Party. The group says ever since Shen Yun's inception in 2006, the CCP has tried to stop the performance. It has tried pressuring theaters to cancel shows, threatened sponsors, and harassed performers' family members in China. Their performances display the virtues of traditional Chinese culture, something the CCP has spent decades trying to destroy. Some dances expose the CCP's brutal persecution of the spiritual practice Falun Dafa. NTD is a proud media sponsor of Shen Performing Arts. The organization says tonight's show in D.C. is scheduled to go on as planned at 7:30 p.m.
Coming up, conservatives from all over the world gather at National Harbor in Maryland for 3 days of CPAC. Luis Martinez brings us the day one highlights, including remarks from Vice President J.D. Vance and House Speaker Mike Johnson, plus our conversations with former British Prime Minister Liz Truss and constitutional attorney John Eastman at the event after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. This year's first Conservative Political Action Conference, also known as CPAC, kicked off today at the National Harbor in Maryland. Our Washington correspondent, Luis Martinez, has the day one highlights.
What's up, guys? How we doing?
The Conservative Political Action Conference 2025 has officially started at the National Harbor here in Maryland. Vice President J.D. Vance was the keynote speaker, and during his opening statement, he referred to the time that it will take for the Trump administration to undo what he called the damages of the Biden administration.
But it's going to take some time to fix what Joe Biden broke over 4 years. And we know it is easy, unfortunately, to burn the house down. It takes a little bit of time to build it back up.
Vice President J.D. Vance also discussed the economy and how the reconciliation process in Congress will be critical to advancing President Trump's policies on tax cuts, on increasing the debt ceiling, and also securing the border, increasing defense, and bolstering energy in the United States.
We spend the American people's money more wisely. If we stop taxing and spending the American people to death, that's also going to bring relief to all of the pricing pressures that are out there. We're going to make it affordable to live in this country again.
Vice President J.D. Vance also mentioned his speech at the Munich Security Conference and doubled down on his critique of what he sees as the censoring of free speech in European capitals.
The point that I try to make to our European friends, and I think that they're our friends, I believe that, I know President Trump does, is that friendship is based on shared values. So let's have shared values. Let's defend democracy. Let's have free expression, not just in the United States, but all over the Western world. That is the path to strong alliances in Europe.
On the opening day of CPAC 2025, we also heard from Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Jim Banks, among others.
I think everybody recognizes President Trump needs 4 years and not 2. And if they took the majority back, they would try to impeach him. They would open the border wide. They would create all sorts of chaos. Right now, as we're sitting here today, 13 House Democrats are sitting in districts that President Trump won pretty handily. That's right.
The Conservative Political Action Conference 2025 will take place at the National Harbor here in Maryland during the next 3 days. President Trump is expected to speak at the conference this Saturday. Reporting from National Harbor, Maryland, Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
New developments on Trump's birthright citizenship order. The Ninth Circuit Appeals Court has denied Trump's bid to reinstate the order. His executive order sought to end birthright citizenship for children of illegal immigrants. Will Trump's order hold up against the Supreme Court? At CPAC, NTD's Paul Graney spoke to constitutional attorney John Eastman.
We're here at CPAC outside Washington, D.C. Delighted to be joined by constitutional attorney John Eastman, senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. John, thanks so much for coming on.
Paul, thanks for having me.
John, a lot to talk to you about. How about we start on birthright citizenship? It was a big cornerstone of the Trump campaign and something he has been talking about since coming into office. How do you see this playing out?
Well, we knew that a lot of the lower court judges would probably issue injunctions right away, and that's exactly what's happened. But what has surprised me about it is how they didn't even bother to read the arguments. They just kind of accepted this notion that the 14th Amendment mandates birthright citizenship. It's almost as if they've written the words, the critical words, out of the Constitution. It doesn't say all persons born here are citizens. It says all persons born and subject to the jurisdiction are citizens. And when they asked what that meant, it didn't just mean subject to our laws. They called that partial jurisdiction. It meant subject to the complete jurisdiction, owing allegiance, being part of our political community.
So break it down for us. Subject to the jurisdiction of. Break it
subject
down for
to
us.
The jurisdiction of the United States. So, and they were implementing the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which says all persons born and not subject to any foreign power. And the two classes of people that excluded, and they were explicit about that, were temporary visitors. They called them sojourners, temporary sojourners, people that were visiting our country but weren't permanently here. And then, of course, illegal immigrants. They didn't have that category then, but those people continue to owe allegiance to their home country, just like the Native Americans that they were talking about at that time continue to owe allegiance to their tribe. And they specifically said, because you owe allegiance to a different sovereign, you're not part of our political community. You don't get automatic citizenship for your children just because they're born here.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Supreme Court actually said this back in the 1800s as well.
Well, in 1872, the first case ever looking at the 14th Amendment, they said exactly that. Said it doesn't apply to the children of diplomats or citizens or subjects of foreign states while residing in the United States. And then in a case called Elk versus Wilkins in 1884, they said the same thing. A Native American was not entitled to citizenship because he didn't owe complete allegiance to the United States. He owed allegiance to his tribe and only derivatively to the United States, and that wasn't enough. So if he could not be a citizen, then somebody who's here as a temporary visitor who's not here with permission at all clearly can't be, under the original meaning of that phrase.
So do you expect this issue to reach the Supreme Court this time? And if so, how do you see it playing out?
I think it'll reach the Supreme Court in fairly short order because you've got judges blocking a major component of what Trump was elected to achieve. I mean, this wasn't a little hidden thing where he's pulled it out of his hat after he got into office. This was a major part of his campaign, and the American people overwhelmingly supported it. So I think the Supreme Court will get it fairly quickly, and then and they're very good at rolling up their sleeves and digging into the historical record. That's what they specialize in. And so I'm optimistic that we'll get a favorable ruling out of the Supreme Court when it gets there.
How significant do you think the change would be in America if birthright citizenship was done away with?
Well, it's certainly not the largest magnet for illegal immigration, but it is one of the top three, and I think that will send a pretty significant message to people that you're not going to get this lottery ticket of American citizenship by coming here illegally and having a baby. And I think the thing that will end almost immediately will be the birth tourism. You know, Chinese people paying 50 to 100 grand to live in a fancy hotel for a month and then have a child and then go back to communist China claiming that their child is a citizen who can come back whenever they want. Or Russians in Miami. Those were our two biggest geopolitical enemies, and they're taking advantage of this incorrect understanding of our 14th Amendment. It's a giant loophole for them to get a foot in the door. Our enemies getting a foot in the door on our soil.
You mentioned that almost immediately this was challenged in court. We see with a lot of the Trump administration's actions this time around, they have been challenged in court. There's this phenomenon of, seems to be district courts making decisions and then apply nationwide. How do you see this?
Well, there were a couple of judges that enjoined some of the rulings and then I think accurately issued an injunction only against the parties to the case, or only within the geographic territory that district court held. The notion that a district judge in Seattle can issue an injunction that affects people in Florida and Rhode Island and everywhere in between is insane. And it's gotten so crazy, the injunction that was issued against the Secretary of the Treasury that he couldn't look at the data in his own department was insane. It's an intrusion on the executive branch and the authority of the president to control that executive branch. And ultimately what's really going on here is this 100-year-long progressive movement thinks that elections don't matter, that the permanent bureaucracy rules us, and that the president works for them rather than the other way around, and that therefore we work for them rather than the other way around. And you actually had a judge saying that, well, the line employees in the Treasury Department are allowed to look at their data, but the boss, the Secretary of the Treasury, can't because he's not approved. I mean, he was just appointed by the guy that was elected. So they've completely distorted our understanding of our system of government. And I think the getting rid of the nationwide injunctions and overturning that false impression is what I think the Supreme Court's clearly going to set right, in again, relatively short order.
John Eastman, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate it.
And we also spoke with former British Prime Minister Liz Truss, who announced the launch of a new free speech platform in Europe. She also spoke about how leaders in the UK and Europe are reacting to the work of the Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. Take a look.
Liz Truss, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Now, Prime Minister, you have a new documentary out called Prime Minister versus the Blob. Explain for us, what exactly is the Blob?
So the Blob is what you would call the deep state in America, but it's the civil service, the bureaucracy, things that we call quangos, like independent bodies. It involves the judiciary. It involves the elites in society, so people in big corporations. And the point about the Blob is they all think the same. They have all drunk the Kool-Aid on woke ideology, so they believe in extreme environmentalism, net zero, transgender ideology, Islamism, anti-capitalism, all of these ideas are sort of filtered into the blob. And what this documentary is about my battle to reassert power for the people and democracy.
And so tell us about how that played out in your 44...
Not well.
Not well, no, that is for sure. So during your 49 days, you were the shortest serving prime minister in the UK. What did that battle look like between you and the blob and what you were trying to achieve in office?
So what I was trying to achieve is get the British economy going. It had been stagnant for 15 years. People were suffering from high inflation, increased cost of living, and things were not getting better in Britain because we had very high energy prices, we had high taxes, a lack of new businesses setting up. So what we did was a budget that licensed fracking in the UK for the first time so that we could use our natural gas reserves, made it easier to drill oil and gas in the North Sea, kept our corporation tax low, lowered taxes in areas where it would attract more business to Britain, and restrained public spending so it wasn't getting out of control. And what happened was these policies were hated by the economic establishment because they had presided over the last 20 years of stagnation, printing huge amounts of money, pursuing disastrous energy policies, pursuing more regulations because they wanted to stay close to the European Union. So they hated what I was trying to do. And what happened was the day before we made our announcement, the Bank of England, which is our version of the Federal Reserve, announced the sale of £40 billion worth of government gilts, which queered the pitch. And then after we announced our plans, they then, to give you a bit of background, they'd failed to properly regulate the pensions market. So it was a bit of a tinderbox. And when interest rates started to rise, there was a sort of run in the markets. It's later turned out, and the Bank of England wrote this in their own report, that 2/3 of those market increases were down to them and their failure to regulate the pension industry, but they blamed it on me. And the point is, when I talk about the blob, all of the people they were talking to, like the mainstream media, the bureaucrats, the people in corporate jobs, they all believe what the Bank of England says, they all agree with each other. So there was massive pressure on me to change course, even though I knew the economic policies were right.
Now, Prime Minister, I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on what's going on here in the United States and how that relates to what you went through. So, of course, Elon Musk with Doge is completely clearing out all of what, you would call the blob, what he would call the deep state, all of these additional federal jobs, all of this spending, all of this money going who knows where. So talk about how what's happening here in the United States sort of parallels to some of the things that you experienced or that the UK is experiencing as well.
Well, I think a lot of the things that I experienced and we experienced in government were similar to what happened to Trump in his first term, which he was sabotaged by people in his own administration. And what is different now is he has spent 4 years really planning, and lots of people have been working on this, like the America First Policy Institute, but they have been actually thinking strategically, how do we deal with this so those people aren't able to sabotage us? And you're seeing that in the executive orders coming really quickly. You're seeing it in what Elon Musk is doing with Doge, going straight to the payment system. So there's no career bureaucrat who can get in the way of that. Payment systems tell the truth about the money that's going out. So I think what we could learn in the UK is that level of preparation about how do you dismantle the deep state is required in order to be able to do it. If you go head to head with them, which is what I did, they will win if you're not prepared. So this is what I learned from what Trump and Musk are doing. It's the level of preparation and, what's called flooding the zone. So doing so much that the enemy is confused, and that's another great strategy.
Also, I really wanted to ask you about Prime Minister. JD Vance was in Europe last week, gave a very consequential speech in front of European leaders, calling them out, basically saying that they're retreating from Western values, specifically pointing to immigration and also to censorship, the lack of freedom of speech that's occurring in Europe. What is your reaction to that speech?
Well, I completely agree with JD Vance. He's absolutely right. And people like Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, are treating George Orwell's 1984 as an instruction manual. That is what is going on. People are being arrested. They're being locked up for what they post on social media. And today at my CPAC speech, I announced that we are going to be launching a new free speech media network for the UK and Europe to get the truth across to people. And it's going to be uncensorable and uncancelable. So we're not having this anymore. We don't want to live in a world of censorship. Britain was the first country to develop the idea of free speech. It's shameful. It's shameful that people are being censored, and we've got to stop it. So that's what our new media network's about.
I really wanted to get your thoughts on this global movement, I guess you could say, of this type of new brand of conservatism and populism. So we have you here. We have a number of world leaders all around the world coming. We have President Milei from Argentina, I heard, maybe Italian Prime Minister. We have folks from Brazil coming, all over, of course, you from the UK and Nigel Farage. Now, a lot of conservatives, when they look at, say, the World Economic Forum or the United Nations and they see all these world leaders come together, they look at it with a lot of concern and disdain, for a globalism coming together to kind of push forward a certain agenda that doesn't really benefit necessarily their own countries or put them first, at least. It puts a global agenda first. So what is your view on this sort of parallel of global conservative leaders coming together, yet putting their own countries first, their own people first, but uniting in certain values, such as free speech?
Well, the thing is, the left have been very, very effective over the last 50 years at coordinating across the world and backing each other up. So when I was being attacked by the deep state in Britain, I was also attacked by the OECD, by the IMF, and by Joe Biden in the US. So the left have been coordinating, whether it's on things like net zero and green policies, whether it's on migration policies, whether it's on how they censor people and how they try and reduce free speech and do online regulation. We have to fight back. People who believe in free speech, national sovereignty, free markets, individual liberty, we've got to take these people on. And I think there's a growing awareness of that. And one of the things I want to do is set up a British CPAC so we can bring people to Britain and get that momentum, because conservatives have to network with each other if we are to take on what has been a very malign global network of the left.
Well, Prime Minister Liz Truss, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All of the best, and we'll be keeping an eye on your new free speech platform, and all of the best.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You.
Coming up in hockey, it's the U.S. versus Canada tonight for the title, and ticket prices are soaring. Dave Martin joins us to discuss when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer, and now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, plenty going on today, but let's start in the NBA, as the San Antonio Spurs have announced that All-Star center Victor Wembanyama will miss the rest of the season with a form of a blood clot in his right shoulder. How does this affect their playoff chances?
Yeah, it's pretty devastating. I mean, he's their best player. He's a budding superstar, really. They were on the outskirts of the playoffs as it was. 12th best record in the West. Only the top 10 can even make the playoffs. Wembanyama, he's practically a guard in a center's body. 7'3", can play on the perimeter and shoot the three. Very agile for his height. Defensively, though, he leads the league in blocked shots, was probably at least in the running to win Defensive Player of the Year. Plus, he's top 20 in scoring and rebounding as well. I mean, just a tremendous player on a not-so-tremendous team right now. Now, technically, his condition is called deep vein thrombosis in his shoulder. ESPN is reporting the Spurs believe he will make a full recovery and be ready for next season.
Now, in other sports news, the Justice Department has charged 7 men from Chile in connection with burglaries at the homes of multiple professional athletes in the U.S. Which athletes are we talking about here?
You know, it doesn't specifically say. This is an FBI complaint we're talking about. But there have been some burglaries made public recently, including Kansas City Chiefs stars Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, plus Cincinnati's Joe Burrow, and some other NFL and NBA players as well. Apparently, actually, what helped crack the case was finding some selfies the alleged burglars took posing with some of the valuables that were allegedly stolen. Now, the selfies were uploaded to an iCloud account that the FBI had a search warrant for. Now, the FBI had issued warnings last year to sports leagues about crime organizations like these, saying athletes were targeted, you know, with the thinking that they had valuables and that is publicly known, you know, when they're away from home. Now, the men allegedly stole about $3 million. Each has been charged with conspiracy to commit interstate transportation of stolen property that carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. So pretty serious.
Well, shifting gears to hockey, former NHL great Bobby Hull had the degenerative brain disease CTE when he passed away, according to a statement released yesterday by his widow.
Yeah, Hull passed away 2 years ago and dealt with short-term memory loss, impaired judgment in his later years, but he decided to donate his brain for the CTE study after seeing fellow Hall of Famer and his friend Stan Mikita decline later in life. Now, CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy and has been typically linked to football players. But years ago, hockey was much more of a rough sport than it is now. There was more fighting, there was more high-sticking, dirty play. Even more amazing, helmets were optional for the longest time. It wasn't, in fact, until 1979 that they were made mandatory, but it came with this grandfather exemption clause that said anyone currently in the league doesn't have to wear one, but all newcomers have to. So throughout the 80s and even into the 90s, on the ice at any given time, you'd have this mix of players, some wearing a helmet, some not. And in fact, Craig McTavish was famously the last player to not wear a helmet under this clause. He retired in 1997, but since then, you know, not like the NFL, the league has placed a lot more emphasis on player safety.
Well, staying with hockey, tonight we have a U.S. versus Canada rematch, but this time for the title of the Four Nations face-off. President Trump has been invited to attend. Will he be in attendance?
It doesn't look like he will. He said he's got to speak. He'll be speaking before the governors tonight in D.C., but they do call the team instead, and we did. Team USA Center J.T. Miller said, quote, "It was awesome to get his support." Now, tonight's game, this is a rematch, of course, of Saturday's game where the U.S. won 3-1. But this game's going to be in Boston this time. Saturday's game was in Montreal. That was where the crowd booed the U.S. national anthem. And there were like 3 fights as soon as the puck was dropped. Team USA was clearly fired up. Now, meanwhile, demand to attend this game is really driving up ticket prices. According to TickPick today, the average ticket price to get into tonight's game, $2,500. The cheapest was just under $1,000. The most expensive was listed for more than $16,000. And this is all to see the U.S. NHL players play Canada's NHLers for the first time in a title game since the 2010 Olympic finals. So the game starts at 8 p.m. on 8 p.m. Eastern time on ESPN. So be there.
Well, lots at stake tonight, Dave. As always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.